Denise Gwen. Reading aloud for you from my novel, His Christmas Eve Proposal, Book 3 of The Medicine Women of Alaska, Chapter 17. Drew roared within himself after inviting Naomi to go hiking with him, and he tried to figure out in multitudes of ways how he could extricate himself from this predicament. You need to cancel. You got to cancel with her. He went to his office to prepare and then email the script to the pharmacy and sat back for a long moment deep in thought. If he hadn't invited her out on a hike, he would have spent the remainder of the day in peaceful solitude. He'd planned to hike alone. He loved bird watching. Normally, a hike in the woods out behind his cabin filled him with a sense of peace. But now that he'd invited Naomi to join him, his heart filled with dread. Drew finished his paperwork, kicked back in his chair, and put his hands behind his head, wondering how he could possibly talk his way out of this date he'd made. What in the world possessed you? Yes, honestly, for the past 4 weeks, he'd avoided her. She didn't know this, but there'd been one day at the grocery store when he'd nearly collided with her in the produce aisle. And then, during that surgery, a kind of rapprochement arose between them. But in the hours, days, and weeks that followed, things had fallen out between them. And now they'd gone for 4 weeks without seeing each other, and his heart ached with longing, but he couldn't bear to get hurt. Just as he'd longed to do back at his cabin, he wanted to kiss her right now. Heck, he wanted to do far more than kiss her. He wanted to make love to her on the enormous bed that overlooked the mountains and lakes. But for the past 4 weeks, he'd avoided her. He'd kept his distance, regardless of the hurt in his heart. Paul had told him he was being stubborn, and that if his life allowed for it, he'd go after the sweet, pretty doctor himself. Well, maybe Paul needed to, because it was evident he wasn't good enough for the top-notch surgeon. At least in his own mind, he wasn't. And perhaps, if he was being honest, he'd secretly hoped that she'd simply appear on his doorstep again, demanding that he pay attention to her. His heart swelled with a secret joy at the temerity she'd shown when she forced herself into his presence. Every time he caught a glimpse of her, his heart glimmered with gladness. He missed her smile, the way dimples formed in the corners of her cheeks, the way her blue eyes sparkled when she was saucy with him. And her laugh, oh, how he missed her laugh. In just the few moments he'd spent in her company, she'd done more for his spirits than anything else he could have done. He'd been so lonely without her in his day-to-day life, and had taken this brief encounter to remind him. And as Naomi stood there demanding his attention, the idea of inviting her on his hike, his time of solitude, had simply popped into his head. A hike with Naomi was something that filled his heart with gladness. He liked the idea of taking a hike with this lovely, beautiful girl. Okay, that's enough. She's probably wondering where the hell I am. Drew pushed the send button on the email, stood up, and walked to his closet and pulled out his hiking gear. He always kept a kit nearby just in case Paul was too busy to tend to an injured hiker way up on the mountain, or on the occasions when he had to book it up to the logging camp. Drew closed and locked the door to his office and walked across the street to Naomi's door. With every step he took, he fought the urge to turn and run back to his office. If he really wanted to, he could come up with a whole host of excuses for not going on this hike. He needed to organize his patient files. Patient reports needed updating. He needed to take some online continuing education courses to update his credentials. So what was he doing going on a date if he had all this to do? It's not a date, it's a hike. It's not a date, it's a hike. He was inviting danger by wanting to be in her company. It'd be so much safer to steer clear of her, and for the life of him, he didn't know why he'd made the choice to be with her. It'd only bring him further heartache when she eventually broke up with him and headed off for more lucrative places to live and work. But once she confronted him on the front stoop of his office, he called her back once, then twice, and this marked the third time he'd taken a chance on spending time with her. He consoled himself. Being with her wasn't the same as being in love with her. They could be friends, right? Couldn't he simply settle to be her friend as opposed to her lover? That was the problem that faced him. He couldn't bear to be away from her, yet at the same time, he couldn't bear to get hurt. If he promised himself they'd be friends only, then he could avoid getting hurt, couldn't he? He just needed to give it a chance.